Welcome back. So in our last video, we were explaining why there's an extra Kanan, and we have three options before us. We went through option one, whether or not it's simply due to the Septuagint, and in the last episode, we were in the middle of describing whether or not the extra Kanan can be explained by an early scribal error. People who argue for option two are going to draw our attention to the overwhelming amount of witnesses to the fact that the extra Kanan is most likely not original to Genesis 11. And then based on this observation, they're going to conclude the following. This evidence shows conclusively that the extra name Kanan is not part of God's original word, but is due to a later copyist error. At the end of the last video, we said that this was faulty logic. Simply because the extra Kanan is not original to Genesis 11 doesn't therefore necessitate that it is within Luke due to an early copyist error. Rather, if you want to demonstrate that it is due to an early copyist error, what you have to show us is that the earliest copies of Luke omit Kanan. And Safati in his article realizes this. And he presents us evidence that in fact the earliest copies of Luke do omit this extra Kanan. So let's look at his evidence. Safati says, in fact, the earliest known extant copy of Luke, the 102-page Papyrus Codex of the Bodmer collection labeled P75, dated between AD 175 and 225, omits the extra Kanan. Thus, the reading in Luke 3:36 cannot be shown to exist before AD 220. So here Safati is arguing, based on P75, that the extra Kanan was added because it wasn't in our earliest document. Now, it's time for you, the audience, to learn something about me. I don't believe in anyone. When Safati tells me that P75 omits this extra Kanan, I don't believe him until I've seen it myself. So I went and I found P75. And here is the part of P75 that records for us the genealogy of Luke. And as you can see, it is very fragmentary. Very fragmentary. So fragmentary, I don't think you can make a conclusive argument based on it. He says that P75 omits the extra Kanan. Well, it looks like P75 omits a lot, simply because it has been broken down so much. So this makes me suspicious of whether or not Safati is correct in using P75 as evidence. So I wanted to find if there was anyone else more credible than Safati who uses P75 for arguing that the earliest copies of Luke omit Kanan. And in fact, there is. Bock, in his commentary on Luke, says the following about the extra Kanan. It is possible that the name should be omitted in Luke since P75 and D omit the name here, but have it in 337. So here is Bock, someone far smarter than you or me, and someone with far greater credentials, using P75 as evidence that the extra Kanan was not in the original document. And to this, I simply have to say I disagree with Bock. I mean, I don't like disagreeing with people smarter than me, but I simply don't see how he can use this as evidence. What makes me even more certain that Bock is wrong here is the fact that he refers to Codex D. Now, Codex D is Codex Bezae, and I don't think it's an overstatement to say that Codex D, when it comes to the genealogy of Luke, is absolutely worthless. Let me repeat that. Codex Bezae, when it comes to the genealogy of Luke, is absolutely worthless. And let me tell you why. When you're reading Codex Bezae and you come to Luke's genealogy, you find out that the author of Codex D has deleted the entirety of Luke's genealogy and slapped in its place Matthew's genealogy. That's right, you heard me correct. It deleted Luke's genealogy and put there instead Matthew's. So in other words, whoever wrote Codex D was crazy. And you cannot use crazy people as evidence for your position. So P75 is too fragmentary and Codex D is too crazy. So this is not good evidence that the earliest copies of Luke omit the extra Kanan. So I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with Bock. And in later episodes, I'm going to talk about Codex D more because it is just too crazy to ignore. Okay, so now we have to ask the questions, well, what do our earliest manuscripts of Luke tell us about the extra Kanan? Well, let's examine them. In Codex Vaticanus, we read that Sheila had Cainan had Arthurashad. So in other words, Codex Vaticanus, a very early copy of Luke, includes the extra Cainan. When we go to Codex Sinaiticus, it goes Sheila, Cainan, Arthurashad. So again, a very early copy, Codex Sinaiticus, includes the extra Cainan. When we go to Codex Alexandrianus, we find it goes Sheila, Cainan, Arthurashad. Again, Codex Alexandrian has a very early copy, has the extra Cainan. So to me, this is all very good evidence that the extra Cainan is original in Luke. So let's go back to our three options, and I think we can safely say that option 2 can be eliminated simply because there is no good early manuscripts of Luke that do not include it. P75 and Codex D do not count. I'm getting too worked up over this. All right, you cannot count them. All of our earliest and best manuscript have the extra Cainan. So it wasn't a scribal error. Until you can produce an early copy of Luke which doesn't have it, we cannot entertain option 2. Which leaves us with option 3, that this was a deliberate change on Luke's part. Okay, let's go back to this slide. Based on this, it is pretty good evidence that the extra Cainan is not original to Genesis 11. So if it wasn't original to Genesis 11, why on earth would Luke insert it? Well, let's ask the opposite question. Is there any evidence that the extra Cainan is not original to Genesis 11? Oh, sorry, let me put it another way. That the extra Cainan is original to Genesis 11. So here's the evidence that is not original to Genesis 11. Is there any proof that it is original to Genesis 11? And as we've said before in option 1, there is versions of the Septuagint which do have it. Is there any other evidence? Because right now this is a bit lopsided. We have a lot of evidence against, but not much evidence for it. Can we add to this side of the argument? And in fact we can. When we go to the Book of Jubilees, which was written in about the year 100 BC, so this is very early, we read the following. And in the 29th Jubilee, in the first week, at its beginning, Arthurashad took a wife, and her name was Reshushiah, daughter of Susan, daughter of Elam, as a wife, and she bore for him in the 3rd year of that week, and he called him Cainan. And then when we continue to read, we hear that Cainan begot a son, and he called him Sheila. So notice what happens when we compare the Book of Jubilees to the Masoretic text. As we've said before, the Masoretic text does not include a Cainan. It goes Arthurashad to Sheila. But in the Book of Jubilees, it adds this extra Cainan. So this is further evidence that perhaps the original copy of Genesis 11 did include an extra Cainan. Borkum, in his book, The Jewish World Around the New Testament, notes that in this text, in Jubilees 8, 1-5, Cainan, he is no mere name in a genealogy, but a figure of some significance. In other words, the fact that the Book of Jubilee mentions Cainan, and he just simply isn't a name in a genealogy, but he is rather a significant person, tells us that when we come to this list, we can add the Book of Jubilees. This is further evidence that Luke may have deliberately added Cainan based on the fact that it is in some copies of the Septuagint and based on the fact that it is in the Book of Jubilees. But notice that this is not a slam dunk argument. Genesis 11 seems to be very confused because we have some evidence for it and some evidence against it. And here is a quote from Hazel, and he really just sums up this issue nicely. He notes, the puzzle of this Cainan remains largely unresolved. This Cainan does not appear in the Hebrew text. Neither is he found in the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Vulgate, or Syriac versions. He is found in the Book of Jubilees. In Luke 3:36, according to the majority of readings of the manuscripts, we find the words of Cainan. It is not certain whether Luke found this name in his source or whether it was later added by a copyist. The contemporary 1st century AD authors of Luke, such as Philo and Josephus, do not have this second Cainan. In 1 Chronicles 1:18-24, the manuscripts of the Septuagint are divided. Some contain it and some do not. So as you can see, this issue really is a mess. We have some evidence for and some evidence against. And that's why Bock, in his commentary, notes that when it comes to the extra Kanan, there is too little evidence to make a clear decision. So now let's return to our three options. And what are we going to do? Well, let's be bold and just make a speculation, because I think there is pretty good evidence that Luke has deliberately added this to his genealogy. And let me just make that case to you. We know that there is precedent based on the fact that the Septuagint has it and the Book of Jubilees has it, that Genesis 11, there were some copies of Genesis 11 that did have an extra Kanan. So Luke may have used this as his source. Secondly, it is very likely that Luke wrote in this extra Kanan based on the sheer fact that our earliest copies of Luke all have this extra Kanan. So this is very good evidence that Luke's original copy had an extra Kanan. However, how then do we come to terms with the fact that there are so many copies of Genesis 11 which do not have this extra Kanan? How do we come to terms with these two facts? And now here is my speculation. My speculation is that at the time of Luke, there existed two different versions of Genesis 11. Some versions of Genesis 11 had an extra Kanan, based on the fact that the Septuagint has it and the Book of Jubilees has it, and there were some copies of the Septuagint that did not have an extra Kanan, based on all these witnesses. So there was two copies of Genesis 11 in circulation. Let's keep that in mind. Now, here is my speculation. I could be wrong, but I think it's pretty good speculation. Luke sat down to write his genealogy, and he had two copies of the Septuagint in front of him. One version of the Septuagint had an extra Kanan, and the other version of the Septuagint did not have an extra Kanan. Which one was Luke going to use? Well, Luke thinks to himself, I really want there to be 77 generations in my genealogy for theological reasons. And based on this desire, Luke chooses a version of the Septuagint which has an extra Kanan, which allows him to add it here, and which therefore allows him to reach 77 generations all the way up to Jesus. This is my speculation, but I think it takes everything in consideration and is rather good. So I'm going to go with this, that Luke has purposely added Kanan. It is a deliberate insertion by Luke in order for him to achieve 77 generations. I'm really quite happy with that speculation. So now, let's go back to this slide. Is this an error? And this is a difficult question. And hopefully you've seen thus far that asking whether or not something is an error is not always a good question to ask, because it's too black and white. And I think what we've seen is that Luke's insertion of an extra Kanan is done for theological reasons. Hence, can we therefore say it is strictly an error if he's done so for theological reasons? I don't think we can. So I'm going to give a cop-out answer when it comes to this extra Kanan and say that this isn't strictly an error. Again, I can understand why people would say it's an error, because it's most likely that the original copy of Genesis 11 didn't have this extra Kanan. And yet at the same time, hopefully these videos have shown you that it's just too complicated to give a black and white answer. Everything is a shade of grey sometimes. So I'm going to give it a question mark. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. These two videos about Kanan have been very difficult to make and just very difficult to get my head around. And I hope I've done justice to them. And hopefully you've enjoyed them. If you have enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up just so I can see that you've gotten something out of it. With that being said, in the next video, we're going to deal with Ani and Admin. I hope to see you there.